My name is Ajit George. My full-time job is in the nonprofit field. I'm the director of operations of the Shanti Bhavan Children's Project, which was featured in the original Netflix documentary series, Daughters of Destiny. But in the TTRPG world, I have written for a number of games, including Dungeons and Dragons most recently, and I'm on another project for Dungeons and Dragons. I'm also on the Guest of Honor Advisory Committee for Gen Con, and I'm also a gaming advocate for the Nebula Awards. So I wear a lot of different hats in the TTRPG community, but that's purely as a hobby. I feel like it's become like a second job for me, but it's really just as a hobby and a love of games. And it's a pleasure to be here, by the way, today. Incredibly exciting and very special to me to be talking to the Indian community. This is a first for me. I have a deep love, obviously, for my work in India, and I'm there often in a professional capacity, but this is a unique opportunity and a fun opportunity to be doing it for leisure.
Yeah, and I think it's important because what really struck me was not just that there are Indians or people of Indian origin writing role-playing, tabletop games and stuff. I mean, that's been going on for a while. What really struck me was the context from which you're writing, like your personal place and like all the things you've described. Because, uh, so I had not never seen you on a TEDx video, and then I discovered that that you talked about such an important thematic thing like dignity, and then I hadn't seen Daughters of Destiny. Like with my little narrow blinded view of the world, I had missed out on a few key things, but those are all topics and themes that I'm very interested in and invested in. So I find that it's not just that you're a person of Indian origin writing, you know, and all that. That's great, but it's more about your personal story and experience that you're bringing to what you're creating, your own authentic experiences. So while a lot of people might know more about you because of those platforms, how did your path with D&D and role-playing games really intersect? Like outside of in just your own life, as a kid or growing up?
Sure. I started playing D&D, I think, and I was thinking about this, I think at second grade. My mom had brought home the basic rule set. If you're not familiar with it, it's a very iconic red box.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
this
yeah.
would so you if you're familiar with it, it's the iconic red box, and it's basically lovingly called the red box D&D or the basic rule set. And I remember just being amazed by it. This kind of imaginary world that you could be part of, not just simply passively read it, but be an active participant. And I think the basic rule set was very simple. It was like fighter, wizard, and then elf was its own thing. That you just an elf, not an elf wizard or anything like that. And you had these different things. But it was just seemed so weird and so interesting and strange. I immediately fell in love with it and played a bunch when I was very young. Then stopped, and then I think the next time I really started playing seriously was in high school, and that was a reaction to being basically one of the only children or kids, teenagers of color, maybe one of two Indians, in a high school that was predominantly all men and all white. And I felt very isolated and very alienated, out of place, and alone. And role playing games and all the other misfit kids that were in role playing games with me were my only salvation. I think it was one of the things that kept me stable and sane. And it was one of the few things that gave me joy in my high school years. I think my mom and dad were a little frustrated and fed up with how much I was playing Dungeons and Dragons during that time because my grades were not great, but I was playing hours and hours with friends, and that was the thing that was most important to me. So role playing games have been in my DNA or my life from a very young age onwards. And I would say the most important part of it was that was a refuge from other tough times in my life, other unhappiness in my life. And that, you know, and it provided that shelter, it provided that escape. It also provided ways to explore my personality. And I talk about this, I think, in an article somewhere. For the longest time, I played, often like white characters because I'm living, born and brought up in the United States, and that was the norm. And you're just thinking everything is normalized as white. And so, in an online game, it was a text-based medium. I don't know if anybody would know it, but it's called Mushing or Muds. That kind of
Yeah,
text-based medium.
yeah,
Um, it was the first time I started experimenting with playing Indian characters. I was like, okay, well, nobody can see me. I'll just try this, see how this works. And I found it really exciting and liberating, and a way to like present who I really was in a very safe context, through characters and role play. So role playing has been so important to me for so long. And I would say that it even comes into my work, the way I think about creatively, solving problems, connecting with the kids that I work with. It has so many dimensions and aspects of my life. I think role playing is incredibly healthy for a
yeah.
mental and emotional health.
So that's the interesting part because uh, this was, I'm guessing, in the early 80s when like you got your hands on the red box and
Yeah.
it was like a whole new world, and elves weren't really a race, they were just magic users, and you had a thief and like
Yep.
all that stuff, and you're
Right.
just sort of assimilating into the world that is being offered to you, and that's why when you mention that you're just making white characters, that's because those are the only characters that are out there for you
Right.
to identify with. But now I can't help, now this just occurred to me that around the late 80s, and that's when, like, say, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom came out. Okay. And I've grown up in a scenario where I've been asked by white people when I was like a preteen, like, do you eat chilled monkey brains? Like
I've had that same question asked to me too. I've had that same question asked to me too. Sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
So those kind of tropes, because essentially these are stories, that inhabit the world and they represent us, whether without our consent, most of the time when they're being told by other voices. But when you first got a chance from being like an 8-year-old to being a teenager, and you were maybe rebellious and angry, and or even like slightly flustered, and you thought, okay, I'm gonna give it a shot. I'm online. I'm playing text-based gaming. Nobody really knows who I am. I'm gonna make a character that truly represents how I feel. I mean, this is just a curiosity of mine, and I asked as well, what was the first character you made that truly represented what you felt?
Wow. I don't know if I had a first character that truly represented how I felt, but this is an interesting. I had a number of characters that I named Naveen, and I named him Naveen after the Carolite actor Naveen Andrews, because watching him in The English Patient was the first memorable time I could remember seeing somebody that resembled me at all in any context in a major Hollywood film on the big screen. And so I had characters after characters named Naveen, just in sort of in his honor and representing, him. And then it started, was an exploration of my identity. Sometimes they would be in D&D. The other big RPG that I was playing a lot of at the time, I played D&D, and then I learned about World of Darkness, and played a lot of characters in that context as well. But it was just variations of experimenting with, maybe I had a character that resembled my parents, or came from Kerala, or came from New York but had family that was living in Kerala. Stuff like that. I was just sort of experimenting, especially World of Darkness. That was easy because it's set in the modern era. For D&D characters, a little trickier, because there was no real context for India.
Right.
Uh, you know, so it was a lot more of a struggle to like kind of connect, but I would just sort of interweave as much as I could,
Mhm.
um, you know, characters that were coded as if Indian within the D&D context.
Right. That's an interesting point because I have had a chance to look at a lot of archival forums where, like back in I think the early 2000s when D&D was slowly coming online, there was a lot of discussions and blogs, and all of it is archived. And I highly encourage people to check it out. It's on a lot of archival websites, and there were attempts, I guess, at trying to appropriate or in some way represent Indian culture, and it
Sure.
was either in the form of monsters or like these off-brand, slightly non-mainstream worlds that maybe didn't sell as much, so they could take more risks with it. Uh, Parts of, say, the Forgotten Realms setting, which
Sure.
most people don't play in. Did you have a chance to sort of explore those, not in your capacity as a player growing up, but maybe when you started getting into writing for games or writing for this particular project? Did you get a chance to see any of those things?
Yeah. So um, for Ravenloft specifically, I read the only Indian related material out there, which was a module I think that came out in the '80s called Web of Illusions. I'm
Hmm.
not sure if any of you are familiar with it. Um, you know, I try to not be too critical in how I approach older material because things written in the '80s were within the context of the '80s, where Temple of Doom and all of these other things are going out there into the world. So it's like this is if you take it from a 2021 lens, you're looking at this and going, "Oh, this is terrible." But when I read Web of Illusions, I think the author was clearly white, and what I felt, and you might have a different reaction, Samir, but I felt like he genuinely was trying, but just didn't know what he was doing, and maybe he had researched as much as he could, but had only the context that, from a very outsider perspective, was trying to write Web of Illusions. But I read Web of Illusions because initially, when Wes Snyder and I talked about it, and Wes Snyder is the project lead for Ravenloft, huge horror fan, an incredibly a talented and amazing writer, and an incredible leader for the project. But when he approached me about writing for Ravenloft, he said, "Hey, you can write anything." First of all, one of the things he was very keen to explain to me, and he said this like 5 times. He's like, "You do not have to write the Indian side for Ravenloft. If you want to write anything you want to write, I will support you." And I was like, "No, Wes, I really want to write Indian material for Ravenloft." In fact, whenever I write for TTRPGs, the only thing I'm willing to really write for the most part is something that has a connection to India, because my time is precious and I don't have a lot of it to write for games. And the only thing that is important to me when I think about these things are representing India in some fashion or the other. I'm not looking to be a full-time writer, so I'm only looking to have an opportunity to put India into media, increase its visibility in pop culture, its acceptance, and exploration, and its prominence in pop culture. So I said, I wanted to write Indian material. So he said, check out Web of Illusions. Is there anything salvageable in here? And I said, I read it, and I was like, no, unfortunately, I don't want to go in that direction at all. I think it has a lot of problematic '80s tropes. It reminds me of sort of Temple of Doom. There's a lot of things here that really don't speak to me. I'm also personally cautious about, and I'm going to say this, and then I would say anybody who wants to go for it, go for it. But I'm cautious about using, Hindu mythology or any kind of Indian specific mythology within TTRPGs, because the opportunity to, um, exploit it or get it wrong, or approach it in a very problematic way is very high. And I try to, when it shows up in my work, I tend to try to approach it from a subtle level.
I think that's a very important point because uh, more often than not, anytime even a video game company today or in the last 3 years has tried to sort of speak to the Indian audience, their approach is very much, okay, let's just create a character that has an Indian aesthetic, some visual tropes, and that's good enough. And sometimes that takes the form of a god, you know, uh, reducing what people take very sacrosanctly and very seriously and with into something flippant. And that's the great thing about personal relationship with god. It's a personal relationship, but the moment it becomes a product, things get murky. And that's, I think, what you're referring to when it's a
Right.
private personal relationship. You can't commodify it. But I would take you back a little bit to what you were talking about in your meeting with Wes and sort of figuring out how you wanted to tell the story, like within the Ravenloft world.
Right.
Were you always sort of like intrigued with the Ravenloft, or had any associations with like the horror genre? As like, is that something you really get like satisfaction from?
I definitely enjoy horror, but my my wife is like 10 times the horror fan that I am, and so I've gotten more of an introduction to horror through her and friends like Wes, who's also a big horror fan. I have loved Ravenloft for many years, since probably the late 80s or early 90s, and have thought it was great. It hits all the classic gothic, horror kind of tropes, and has been interesting in that regard. So I have as a player, I have a history with Ravenloft for many years. I didn't. What I think was exciting for me about being asked to work on Ravenloft was that um, Ravenloft has the opportunity to like do lots of different things because each of the domains of dread are almost their own world or their own like universe, or they're demi-planes, right? So they're basically these self-contained mini worlds, and that allows for a lot of liberation because you're not necessarily tied into like, oh well, this is what the neighboring kingdom is doing and all these other things. You don't have to really you don't have to worry about all of the connections with 50 other things. You can create a self-contained area, and explore that self-contained area in its own way. And I think that's one of the great things about Ravenloft is its ability to like, for new writers to D&D, to just be like, okay, the only thing I need to focus on is, am I getting the things right for the myths or the general rules for Ravenloft. Once you get those things down, the rest of it is just like create what you want within this sandbox, and that was very exciting to me. And so Wes and I started talking about it, and I said, I 100% I'm going to do something Indian. And I'm sorry I can't do anything with Web Evolutions of Shiriraji as it is. I'll try to do some Easter eggs. So Arajani is named Arajani because it's sort of a nod to that character. There's a couple of nods like that, but otherwise it's
It's a whole new invention.
Calicarius Hook. Yeah. Sorry.
It's a whole new invention because like
Correct.
having read your chapter and sort of seen the kind of nuances you've sort of approached when it comes to the kind of geography, the names of certain regions.
Right.
I mean, as a person from and living in India, a lot of it immediately, conjures up local images, local experiences. Even if I haven't been to a certain part of the nation, because it is quite a big country, there is a visual memory
Yes.
we all share, when it comes to
Sure.
our local media. And when you say backwaters, I mean, even if it's a government tourism ad, like that is
Sure.
enough to sort of give you a visual sense of your own
Sure.
country. But when you started piecing together all these different aspects, from plot potential, the geography, all these layers of world building, clearly, like the name itself was also probably inspired by some, like my theory was always, is it inspired by some place in Karnataka or the Carnatic region, and or the way you've set up the dynasty and the friction, political friction, as well as the sibling rivalry, so deeply entrenched in Indian culture and even
Right.
our old stories.
Sure.
How did you like piece that together? Did it come in organically, or did you actually look out to history and like other things? How did you piece that world together?
Yeah, that was very tough. So the first thing I did was probably the same mistake that every new writer to D&D might make, which is like, I've had 100 ideas for 100 years, and I'm going to put everything all in this one piece. And particularly, I felt a huge weight and burden. I thought maybe this is my only chance to represent India ever in D&D. I don't know if I'm going to be asked to do anything ever again. I don't know when the next time will be. I am hungry to see this. I have to believe other people are hungry to see this and want to see it. So let me capture all of India in one shot, which is like a ridiculous, completely absurd and ridiculous idea. But that was what I came at. That was just me being overly excited, very eager, and feeling also like a genuine weight and burden to like to put as much of India as I could. So um, I mean, the original draft for Calicari and my section is, I mean, I think the thing that finally makes it in the cut, I submitted maybe 5,500 words, and I think it's about 4,500 words. So we had Wes and I had to trim about 1,000 words, and I can talk a little bit about what that might have been. but I was working at like 30,000 words at one point, plus. There was a whole bunch of other characters and uh, considerable side stories. The mini domain the ashram of Naranjan is actually was originally part of the first incarnation. So they're all interweaved and they actually all have a connected backstory with each other. How I started was I started thinking about one of the things I personally don't like is a one for one analogy, because I think that for me that becomes a little problematic is that you're fictionalizing a very specific set of things and you're just sort of like I don't want to be locked into that. I want to use it as inspiration, root inspiration, and then move away from it and kind of organically create it. So you're completely right in that the geography, the location names, all of that is strongly influenced from the Carnatic region, and Kerala, the backwaters. All of that is tied in together. So very strong South Indian feel, which is either the place that my family's from or that I'm working in, and I am seeing very regularly, and I'm very much in connection with. But other parts of it are taken from other areas. So Ramya is from Razia Sultana and the Delhi Sultanate. If your viewers are familiar with her story, I found her story as I think she is the first Muslim woman queen of any Muslim empire. Her rise to power, her rivalry with her brothers, her being overthrown, trying to reclaim her throne, really interesting. And that was the genesis of the story between Ramya, Riva, and Arjani. I mean, I took Razia as a start and then kind of moved away from that
Yeah.
as a basis. But the repeated story of Indian siblings fighting for the throne or power is repeated in many dynasties, not just simply Razia's story. But Razia was the original inspiration for Ramya. There's a lot of hints that if had she been able to rule for longer, she would have been quite an effective, queen and leader. I think her reign was only 4 years, and she was trying to institute changes. She was trying to do some things that were interesting. And I picked up every book. If you see an earlier photo of my root inspiration, there are a lot of books that have information about her. I try to find everything I could about her short rule. There isn't a lot because not a lot survived, but that was the basis. And then I thought about physical structures, and that is where I moved a little bit to the Mughal Empire. The Cerulean Citadel. If you look at the art for the Cerulean Citadel, I hope some people will notice the similarities to the Red Fort, and that was a very specific call there. It should be a little bit bluer than the art had, but that was it is the Cerulean Citadel is very much modeled after the Red Fort. The Sapphire Throne is modeled after the Peacock Throne. The Tower of Traders is modeled after the Tower of Thieves and Atta Delhi. So all of those things are a little closer to a one for one, but I try to put as much distance so that you can maybe feel the inspiration, but it wasn't so obvious that I'm just wholesale one for one immediately lifting it. I had the elements. I kept on thinking about it. I did tons of research. I just immersed myself constantly. I used my lived experiences as a base, and then I just was nonstop researching for a couple months and basically living, breathing this material and just writing tons of notes and thinking about it. That was sort of the basis of all of that.
Was that an extension of your interest in history, or perhaps was it in any have you run games? Have you been a dungeon master, or have you always enjoyed being a player? What sort of connections between your playing experience or as a participant of the form? I always like to think of D&D and most tabletop role playing games as a collaborative art form, because at its
Sure.
best people sort of are performing, and they're performing for the joy of their friends and sometimes even
Yeah.
strangers. So it becomes kind of an art form and a framework for people to work in, and either you're on the side of the storyteller who's setting up the world, or you're on the side of the characters who are reacting to the plot and making choices. did you bring any of your prior either dungeon mastering experience or player experience into looking at the world and asking yourself, okay, how will a player look at this, or how would a dungeon master look at this?
Yeah, that's very much, something Wes would urge us. I've both been a player and a dungeon master many, many times. In the past, some of my style has been to like create large sections of worlds and build out all of that myself, and then have my players have an opportunity to immerse themselves in that and explore it. And like as they're exploring it and asking questions or pushing me, then I realize, oh well, this is an interest area they're interested in, so let me continue to build out that section, right? It's sort of like when you think of it, and if you look at Calicari, Calicari could have easily been a lot longer, but fifth edition's I think ethos is to build out the movie set as a set as opposed to the whole city, right? So you're giving a set for a DM to play with, and then they can build off of that as their interests, rather than try to build, dump tons and tons of lore that you have to read, and then you're like, am I reading an encyclopedia or am I reading a game, right? And like, if you want to read an encyclopedia, then we should go read history, or maybe a novel, right? That's a
Yeah.
more passive reading experience.
Mm.
For games, it's an interactive experience. So I think fifth edition does a really good job of trying to balance between giving you enough lore to work off of, but then not too much that you're overburdened and you're stuck in somebody else's vision, right? So Calicari is enough to hopefully inspire, particularly, people of Indian origin who understand, some of my root inspiration, to go, oh, I get the touchstones here. I understand what's going on here. I can take it in a new direction myself. And actually, I'm a strong believer of like, my words are not precious. Once it's out there into the universe, you should all do whatever you want with it. I mean, I'll be very unhappy if you do like really terrible things with it, or you end up being really gross or inappropriate with my material. That would make me sad. But at the end of the day, I can't control what anybody does with it. But fifth edition is really about giving you all the tools to do, and the touchstones and the symbols and kind of like the prompts to create your own stories from that, not to be prescriptive, but to be, a supportive atmosphere. And so that was my mindset. And especially as I've gotten older and time is less precious, or is more precious and time is less available, I don't have a ton of time to do huge, lengthy campaigns with hundreds and hundreds of pieces of material. I have to actually, and I think I enjoy this a lot, is to actually talk to my players and see what they're interested, get their ideas, and it's a much more interactive back and forth experience. And that's how we're mutually building a story together, as opposed to me telling a story to them.
Right. And that's actually like I find it really like sort of tickling about the old traditions versus the new traditions, because when I first saw D&D, it was fourth edition and it was too tactical and it was too video game on a table approach.
Right.
And then I started listening to people play advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and that totally like like blew my mind. And then I was like, I want to
Yeah.
do that. And then I saw a taco table and I was like, okay, I don't want to do that. And then fifth edition was the ideal
Right.
thing at the right time that to capture my interest. And but connecting that same thought process to what you've written in your work, what hit me was that this is actually so much more bigger than fifth edition. Because while I love it to death, and there are people who I've encountered who I've had to sell on fifth edition, like, oh, I know you like 3.5 or you like Pathfinder, give fifth edition a shot. But what I loved about your chapter and the section that you've written is I can take that into any system. It's not actually bound to any particular system, because it's actually a world and it's about people and characters and motivations and the culture and geography, and even borrowing like monsters and things from OGL or even outside of the the prescriptive thing that fifth edition offers. It was so like mind blowing, because I was like, I can put towards the end of the chapter, and I hope it's not a spoiler. There is a lot of one line suggestions for renown. You know,
Right.
and
Right.
I read those line by line, and I was like, each of these could be an adventure. Each of these could be structured into a campaign. You could build a whole campaign around how do you build a reputation amongst these two factions of battling siblings. And it's so much liberating for, I think, a dungeon master to see a world written in a way that gives them the right tools to
Right.
put their own flavor and spin on it. And I think, I mean, I've read yours and I've read a couple of others, and I think a lot of, I mean, I'm seeing it already. Like that's exactly, I think, was that the intent of the Dreads domain of Dread, to give those kind of, um, like ignition to the player community and the DM community?
100%. I think that's what Wes was going for. That was, we were working off of his design goals. This is his vision, and so he gave us like, here's the template, here's this, the structure you need to work out of, and you can see from the different domains there was vastly different interpretations and different ways of approaching this, and different types of stories, which I think is the other really incredible thing about the entire book is you're just getting a wealth of material from a number of different authors having different ways of approaching the same template and the same structure. But yeah, that was very much his intent, was to give the tools for DMs and for players to tell their own stories and build their own worlds and create their own campaigns out of this, and not to be prescriptive to, you must do this, then you must do this, then you must do this, and this is the only way of telling this story. There are a lot of there's an adventure in the book which you can go through that and play to, all this, scripting points. And there are a lot of other great 5th edition books that have lots of adventures, but this is not a structured adventures heavy story. This is a tool set for you to tell your own adventures and your own stories. And I think that is one of the most powerful things about it. Similarly, that was, I think, the decision about not putting the stats for the Dark Lord. I have some ideas about what Ramya might be and what she looks like, but I like the fact that you can, she's a Death Knight, and Arjani is a Rakshasa, and Ariba is a Karnaloth, and you can just, that's a basic, but then you can adjust them as required for your campaign. What the book assumes is that you're a smart, confident person who's going to be able to like use the basis. Okay, here's a structure. She's a Death Knight. Then move it as you need it for your campaign, for your players, and not that you have to be this level and this having these kind of things, and you have to do this to fight her. So that's really it is. It assumes a level of like back and forth with the reader, a respect for the reader, that I really love, and was one of the reasons I was super excited to be on the project.
But that's a very interesting point, because the idea of how a character within the world, especially a Dark Lord stature character, who's what we would call end game content, in case of like, okay, you're ready to take this boss on, as the video game terminology would put it. But a similar thing, and again connecting back to Ravenloft, was when going from Return to Ravenloft in like the late 80s or early 90s, when they redid it for 5th edition. And now this is a bit of a segue or a move away from what we were talking about. But did you consult a lot with, say, Christopher Perkins? Because when he did Ravenloft, the idea of rebooting that realm and rebooting it around, because I think you've done something similar in the space you were allocated, which is to give compelling characters.
Right.
No universe is like, it's just history, made up history and fantasy, unless there's a character to give it some heart. And that's what you've done with your characters. And that's what I saw happening in the 5th edition Ravenloft with like Strahd, and the different NPCs and cultures surrounding Ravenloft. So did you have a lot of like consulting with Christopher Perkins, for example, since he did launch the 5th edition world of Ravenloft over this, or was
Yeah.
it like, how was that?
So I'm sure Wes and Chris have talked quite a bit in the relaunch, and they're they're in the same company and they're working right next to each other. So I'm sure they had, in terms of the structure, they had it. Wes gave us the structure, and I know Chris Perkins independently, and we've talked about other things with regards to representing minorities and people of color more in D&D. And Chris has been Chris and Jeremy, both as principals of D&D, have been very positive and very supportive and very like proactively engaged. I can't really talk about more than that, except to say that like they are working on things, and D&D takes like, I think people think, oh, they should change immediately, or so they should do something immediately. The cycle for a book production is like 1.5 to 2 years. The process, like they'll have an idea and you'll see it like now, but that idea was like 2 years ago. I mean, the Genesis idea can get even longer than that. The book cycle is 1.5 to 2 years, but like they're still in the iteration phase much earlier than that. So all of these things are a process, but most of my conversations were directly with Wes, and we would just jam on the phone or on Zoom and just back and forth about a lot of ideas. And Wes has a very grounded history in horror and very grounded knowledge in Ravenloft. So he was the editor in chief over at Paizo for a while. So he brings about 20 plus years of experience to his work, and I'm sure all of these things were in mind. He's a very forward-thinking, very progressive-thinking designer and writer, which is obviously reflected in the work that you see in that book and the choice of writers that he brought on board for this book.
Did you have an opportunity to just, I don't know, hang out with other writers or connect with them during the course of the initial phase when they were putting a roster together of, okay, we want more voices? Did you have a
Sure.
chance to interact? Because I know like one person who it would have been easy for you to interact with is your wife, because she contributed an amazing world of her own in the same collection. But apart from that, like, did you have much overlap with the other writers?
So I did, but only because I know them in a personal context, and we all game together, we play together. But we got brought in. One of the weird things about COVID is it gave me. There were all the terrible things about COVID. If there's a small silver lining, it allowed me some more time for creativity or the creative process, because I wasn't going anywhere. I was in lockdown. I was no plans to return to India. So I was able to work on Calicari and Ravenloft during that time. With regards to, but because we're all in lockdown, we can't see each other, and so we could jump on video calls and all that, but we weren't able to see each other in person. But Renee Knipe, who wrote for the book, also works for Shanti Bhavan, and she's also a gamer who also works for Shanti Bhavan, and she worked on a couple of the other domains in that book. John Stavropoulos is he wrote sections, or he contributed to sections on creating your Dark Lord, creating your own domain, all the safety mechanisms. And he is my best friend. I'm going to be his best man in his wedding in a couple of months. I know Kira Magran. We've gamed together quite a bit. I know Banana. She goes by Banana Chen. I know Banana Chen. We've been. In fact, we started playing together when she first started moving from board games into RPGs. So I actually know a lot of the writers in different contexts. Some of us would talk about our work or show each other our work. I definitely had them look at, a few of my friends in the community look at who are in the book, because everything is under NDA, so I can't show anything to anybody else that wasn't in the book. But I would show to John and Renee and others what I was writing and ask for their opinion and their feedback, and vice versa. So it was a collaborative process in that regard.
I mean, that's actually a lot. That's a very familiar story, like the people you love playing with are the people you want to share everything with. And one of the most common woes I hear from DMs is like, I have something planned for my players, but I really like, you want to spoil it for them. It's that kind of a feeling that it's such a great story. Why can't we just get to it? But at the same time, getting to it, the journey of it is itself
Yeah.
its own reward. In some ways, I like to think that what you've kickstarted with your immediate work is the kickstart for perhaps something bigger down the line, because you can't have you can't just like share a world and these amazing character concepts and then not write about them, say in a short story or maybe even a novel. Like I mean, the number of Forgotten Realms novels that stock bookshelves the world over and Kindles are hundreds. I can totally imagine a shelf space in the future awaiting a series of stories that bring this kind of world into it, and knowing your past as a as like you've written fiction in the past as well, and but it's you've always kept it private. Like you haven't, I don't think I've been able to find anything that you've
Sure.
shared out there, but you focused writing for games, telling stories via the gaming medium as opposed to. But is it like, is that on the horizon? I mean, that doesn't fall under your NDA with Wizards, I hope, because that's more of a
So, Calicari and all of that is owned by Wizards of the Coast. So, if I want to do anything with that going further, I would have to do it through Wizards or with Wizards' permission. Wes and I have talked about, the possibility of returning to Calicari in some fashion, and that would be something that I would be very interested in. So that may be in the cards in the future. And I would be excited to see other people do so, thoughtfully and smartly. I feel like, especially with games, that it is, I should be creating seeds that other people can take forward. I don't want to be like, oh, this is mine and only mine and nobody else can touch it. I know there's some authors who are very, very tough and like they don't want any fan fiction, they don't want anything like that. And I'm the opposite. I'm like, I put this out in the universe, good luck, enjoy it, do with what you want. Try to stay to the root inspiration, but I'm not going to take it personally if you go in a new direction. I'll be excited to see what you do with it. So I think the return to it is definitely possible. I would be excited to do so. Simultaneously, I'm not, I don't have like the George Lucas mentality of like, I have to return to my work and continue to tinker at it and change things and tinker at it and change things. I think there's so much more creative opportunities. I'm on a project that I cannot talk about, but I am so excited about. I mean, if I was so excited about what I was doing with Ravenloft, you can take my excitement and multiply it by 10 by what I'm working on right now. And so
give us a timeline or a clue, something like
I mean, I can only say that it's going to be in 2022. I think the Indian community is going to enjoy it and love it. Hopefully, fingers crossed. But I think they're going to really enjoy it, and I think it's going to be a groundbreaking piece of work. That's the only thing I can really say. But
on it, even though I think I've tried to push on it even offline, like, in our communications, because there's something in the works and we must know. But fair enough. Patience is a virtue, as they say. But in the shorter term, what I think would be relevant for me to mention is the whole community of tabletop role playing aficionados and enthusiasts and world builders that we sort of try to collate under PanicNot are filled with a lot of people from game design. They're filled with people from other art forms. Some of them have even self-published their work on DM's Guild, whether it's a module or something. And given your like exuberance to share your world with the community, I scarcely doubt that somebody won't take you up on that. Like somebody won't be like, oh, I would love to write a module or an adventure set in this world that I've been gifted. Now, what's your advice? Like you've given us some work which is the world, but from coming from the other side of writing an adventure in that world, speaking to our audience and our community, what would be your advice to them? Because they are not writing just for themselves or their table, they're writing for the world when they put it up on DM's Guild. So is there something you would tell them?
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, I would definitely encourage people to, use Calicari or any of the other pieces that really speak to them in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, and use that as a launch pad to create their own material for DM's Guild. As I understand, the DM's Guild allows you, if it's out there in the official D&D products, you can put it up there for the DM's Guild. So feel free to like explore with that, and feel free to explore with the characters. If you're gonna approach Calicari directly, I would argue that like the goal of this domain is not to fight Ramya. I know you joked about like her being the big bad and fighting the Dark Lord at the end, and I think that's definitely one story if your characters are really high level, and that's kind of the goal of it. But she has a huge undead army, and she's got all of these forces, and she is incredibly powerful. With artifact level weapons, that's in my mindset. That's how I've described her, and the book also alludes to that as well. I generally don't, for some reason or the other, I think like there's definitely satisfaction at the end of like a long story to maybe finally fight like the big bad and defeat it. But one of the most powerful video games for me, and I don't know how many of your viewers would know this or if you are familiar with it, is it was like late 90s or early 2000s, was a game called Planescape Torment.
Oh, of course,
And if
of course. I mean,
great, great. So great, we both have like that shared history. That game is amazing, right?
yeah,
But if you're not familiar with that game, the best ending of that game is just defeat the big bad without combat. If you're fighting the big bad directly with in a battle, you get an ending that's fine, but like the most satisfactory ending, and all endings are sad, which is also great. I love that as well. But the most satisfactory ending is a non-combat ending to that sequence, and there is not a lot of mandatory battles in Planescape Torment. There are some, but not a lot. I would say similarly with Kalikari, your goal is not to like kill Ramia or Arjani or Riva. Killing one faction ends up causing lots of problems for Kalikari. You kill Ramia, and I think Arjani and Riva are worse. They're monstrous. Like, at some point, Wes is like, we've got to. This is for a lot of readers, so we can't maybe put all of the material that you have in here in there. But like, if you look at the art for Arjani and Riva, they're not eating Indian food, and there's a reason why you're seeing bones. They're eating human beings. They're both cannibals, and they're monstrous in their proportions and the depths of their depravity. I think Arjani embraces it. I think Riva hates it about herself, but she's locked into this destructive pattern. Ramia similarly is just killing everyone that's closest to her because she is ready for betrayal at any time, and she hates it and she can't escape it. They're all locked in these destructive patterns, and I think this is familiar. Even if we look at ourselves, you think about the destructive patterns. So like, tomorrow I'm going to change myself. I'm going to be a better person tomorrow. I'm going to change all these bad habits about myself, and then you're like, oh great, I'm still doing the same thing. And this is, you take that and you amp that to like, 100 times out, and that's the kind of epic proportions you're having with these characters. So the stories that you're telling with Kalikari are about being trapped between these two tidal forces and these factions, and how do you mitigate harm? How do you reduce harm? How can you balance it? But the horror is that you really can't, right? The horror is that, if you're trying to balance between these two factions, to gain renown with both factions, you are also doing horrible things eventually. And I had more destructive elements built in there, but once again, this book is meant for a wide audience, so there's a level that you can't put in there. But it really is, you're trapped in a destructive cycle trying to work with this, and that is kind of the point of Domains of Dread. Like, these are not, I think, so much of D&D is heroic. And what is great about Ravenloft is the exploration of being of stories where heroism maybe fails, and that you are trapped in the horror of the moment, and you try to make the best of it, and you're struggling through to some kind of better place. And I think that's what I recommend, is these subtle stories, these stories of hard bargains and incredible challenges. One of the areas that I didn't get to explore as much because of, once again, space, was also how the common people are affected. I speak to, like, there's a third faction, or I think it remained in there. There's implications that, like, there are common people like hiding in the backwaters trying to like rebel against the dynasty. They hate all the siblings. The siblings have been terrible for the kingdom. And that's also another area to explore and tell their story, right? And that's influenced very much from my work from Shanti Bhavan, and feeling that often the powers that be don't care about anybody in the local villages and the rural settings and the communities. Working with them and being, I live, when I'm in Shanti Bhavan, I'm living quite literally in the rural villages, or right next door where we're all together. The school's right there. And you talk to the local people, and they say that it does not matter who's in office or what happens. It just, all of it for them feels the same. And it's just one power switching with another power, and they're all equally uncaring. And that really influenced my work with Kalikari, the way I think about it. and it's all of it's subtle. It's all of its small, sentences here and there that you don't elaborate on. But those are stories also that would be interesting to tell.
I think that
Uh,
actually succeeded because in close reading in between the options that are provided in the circumstance, the moment you bring in, say, as a DM, which I think every good DM does or game master does, is a level of empathy to even these fantastical NPCs, because there's a tragedy to Ramya's paranoia. There's a certain tragedy to even the other cannibalistic villains, because that they all want to be different, and that is where it's not about combat, it's about storytelling and things like that. But there are lessons woven into almost every story we run, even though they may not be in the material that is handed to us. The moment it passes through the players and the game master, it changes and becomes something else, and in that sense we have found it to be a really good educational tool. Whether it's pure simple education, even adult education, whether it's about building empathy. Now, the question I thought I would, since you mentioned Shanti Bhavan, I would bring up is, have you had an opportunity to sort of introduce elements of role playing game and narrative collaboration, you know, in that environment? Because that's your day job, that's your passion, your true passion. And, this is the hobby side of things, which you are sort of connecting with it. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity for you to share a bit about that. Like, have you used
yeah.
D&D in that environment?
My wife has. She's brought role playing games to Shanti Bhavan and taught some games there, and had played some games with them, and had a lot of fun, and the kids really loved it. Myself, not so much. Though I have used it with the boys as a teaching tool. If you watch Daughters of Destiny, it's the last episode, and I'm talking to the boys about equality with women, with feminism, trying to get them to understand and get them to kind of recite what the experiences they see, their sisters and their mothers and their family members who are women. What is that like, and how's that lived experience for them? What the clip doesn't show is more role playing along those lines, where the kids are really trying to embody the women in their life. And I use role playing techniques, and I have with the boys in different contexts. Have used role playing techniques for them to create empathy, and I think that's one of the most powerful things about role playing is the ability to step outside of our own selves, our own limitations, and it forces us to embody something that is maybe similar to us but not us, a character that's different, and push ourselves to, like, sometimes I enjoy playing characters that have like just a different, very different perspective on life than I do, and then if I'm really playing into that character, then I have to explore, why does this character have this point of view, and why do they believe the things they do, and what does that mean to them, and what are they scared of, and what do they hope for, and what hurts them, and what gives them hope. And those are incredibly powerful tools for empathy building, and for understanding other cultures and other people and other lived experiences, other income classes, all of those questions. And so I have used that subtly, not strongly overtly, but subtly with the boys in sessions with the boys. And I hope to explore more of that. I would love to play a D&D session with them one of these days too, but it
I mean,
just
I'm
hasn't
sure
had.
that, I mean, now that I know that there are these avenues open, I'm sure one of the things that people can consider doing, especially in our community, is once the world returns to a semblance of normality, and we all just want to like run out into the forest and just breathe fresh air for once. Maybe some of us will travel to Shanti Bhavan, and sort of take up that opportunity to not just maybe away from home, but even in our local communities and neighborhoods, to try to use these tools and games that we use for fun and hobbies, and direct it in new interesting directions, whether it's advocacy or philanthropy or even just education and training. I think it's a great opportunity, and mixing those two worlds, especially from your perspective, I think is a very valuable uh, sort of a benchmark that we can all sort of consider, like how would we like to use our free time, because everybody here loves it as a hobby, just like you. But maybe we can find different ways. So before, I know we're running close to our end time, and I just had one last question before we have a few questions from the audience. And that last question is mainly, who have been your biggest influences when you've been, as a writer, as a storyteller, as a game narrative person, and I will ask you to exclude your wife from that list. So just make it easy for you. So
um, yeah, I was gonna say my wife is definitely a strong influence. She's working on a AAA D&D Dungeons and Dragons video game right now, and it's one of the blessings of being in a pandemic is we're working in home offices right next to each other. So I'll just walk over and look at her screen every once in a while and look at the art and just be amazed. I'm like, wow, this is incredible. It's going to be a great story. Um, that's hard. I was very strongly, I wouldn't say there's specific authors, but I was very strongly, obviously, by like the 80s, 90s D&D. But World of Darkness also had a very strong influence on my thinking about telling stories. So any of the like the 90s vampire, mage, changeling, all of those were really influential. I think in terms of modern writers, John Harper, with he's probably most famous for Blades in the Dark, but Lady Blackbird was the first independent indie role playing game that I ever saw, and he put it out in like a 6-pager. I don't know, maybe it's 10, 12 pages. It's really short, and I think it's free still, but it was free when I got it. He just put it in the world, and a lot of us looked at it and were just amazed at what he was doing with it, and I was very, very surprised at what he was doing with terms of mechanics and storytelling ability. Vincent Baker with Dogs in the Vineyard, which is another older independent game. He's more famous for Apocalypse World, but Dogs in the Vineyard was very powerful and very motivating for me. Avery McDonald is probably Avery Alder is probably my most one of the most influential. She wrote a game called Monster Hearts, and that was powerful and influential for me in terms of thinking about, you know, the gay experience, the queer experience, being not being in control of who you love, and not being the first time, if you're not familiar with Monster Hearts, you're playing. It's sort of like Buffy the Vampire. You're all teenage monsters in that kind of like a Buffy universe in high school. And there's a mechanic called strings where if somebody gets a string on you, they can like make you attracted to them. And you have no control over this. And the first time I had this mechanic used on me, I was like, wait, I have no control about being attracted to this. Like, my character has no control over being attracted to this other character. That's outrageous. Like, I should be able to control of this. And then like I sat on it for 24 hours and I was like, oh my God, you don't have control over who you're attracted to. I get it. That makes so much sense. And it was like this like awakening, and it hit me really powerfully, actually. And I think about Avery's work quite often. So she's very influential to me. Um, from D&D, have tremendous respect for for Chris Perkins, Jeremy Crawford, both of them. Quite close with Jeremy, and we get to talk pretty regularly. He's just a very, very thoughtful thinker with enormous encyclopedic knowledge about religion, mythology. I think in another world he might have been he might have followed his calling for religion. He's very smart and very deep in his analysis. And then, of course, Wes and I, have worked on Ravenloft, and we are jamming on other things. And so he's been very influential too. In fact, in many ways, Jeremy and Wes have probably taught me the most about designing for D&D. But having conversations with them quite often has really taught me about what is needed to write for D&D and what it really needs to design for D&D. So I would say those are the most influential in the most recent past.
That's actually, I a lot of those names I'm going to look up, and I just want you to repeat. I just need you to repeat the Monster Hearts. Is that the game?
Yeah,
Because it
and
sounds
Monster Hearts by Avery Alder.
Avery Alder, because that sounds amazing. As it kind of breaks the very agreement I have had with most of my players, and I love that it's framed in a like a scenario where it's like a passion simulator wherein putting yourself in a completely different mindset than you ever had to. I think it might be really interesting for a lot of people to try out and see what it's like. I mean, I don't know much about it, but just going by your description of Monster Hearts, that's definitely going to be something I check out next. But of course, Christopher Perkins and the entire Wizards team is somebody who we have been following for a long time, particularly
Yeah.
because of their media presence and their podcasts and stuff. But also, they've done a lot of writing back in the olden days on like Dragon and Dungeon magazine. Uh, but now I think I could just go on forever about the
Yeah,
company.
I would add James White to that list in terms of like
Oh,
people that have been working on
Eberron,
D&D
like,
for a long time.
yeah. I mean, are you talking about Eberron creator? Keith Baker,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah, he was a co-creator for
Okay.
Eberron. He was creative. He's worked. James White's worked on so many D&D books. He co-wrote the Theros book with Wes. He was at Magic for a while, but he's returned to D&D. And James is also another like very deep thinker who is very thoughtful and very caring. Also very very supportive of greater diversity in D&D, and he is talked to me about it and asked me, and we've worked together on things together, and he's the whole D&D team is pretty amazing. Amanda Hammond recently joined. She moved from Paizo to Cobalt Press, and just I think in December of 2020 joined the team as a senior designer. She is very talented, and you should definitely keep an eye out for her work as what she's doing for D&D as it comes out in the next 1 to 2 years. I'm sure she's going to be working on some incredible stuff. So I have a tremendous respect for the D&D team, the senior team. They're all very talented and very decent human beings.
A few of our community members posted some questions for us, and I think you answered some of them in our general conversation. So I'm just going to focus on things that are a bit more gamey, game related. A question from Ayush: how do you see the setting that you've created? Is it filled with constant skirmishes? Are there parties warring and intriguing all the time, or in a more mechanical way, how big are the armies and the troops? Like how much of a dynasty are we talking here?
Yeah, I envision it as a continent spanning dynasty, though a part of it only entered into the domains of dread. So it's almost like it's been splintered off from the rest of the world. And Ravenloft's a little weird in that. Like some text of Ravenloft says it's just recreated in the Shadowlands and the Demi plane, and others are like the mist rolled in and just like captured a piece of it. So a lot of arguments as to how that kind of functions. But they are two dynasties, or rather one dynasty, and it is, I think that what was important to me that it is, a lot of demiplanes in Ravenloft are very small, and this is actually, I think, quite large, and huge dynasties, lots of towns and villages, and sites and locations. So there's plenty to explore in there, and there's legends of like previous dynasties and so on and so forth, and the ashram that's connected there is all of the stories are actually interconnected. Like the bronze dragon that's there actually was in service to the dynasty. Renown was, I had worked from Renown using the original Renown system, but had changed it to something else called a favor system that was going to like really incorporate deeper elements of Indian culture, of like maybe it was sort of a speaking to like power of power, indifferences between different levels of society, and how you can gain more power by doing service to a higher level, but then you get they then you're maybe corrupted by the choices that you have to make to like appease somebody that's more powerful. And that was my observation of like class and power inequality in India, and thinking about what that means. But because of room limitations, we decided to just scale it down into a simpler like renown system.
Actually, I love that original concept, to be honest, because
Yeah.
it's far more representative of the real world, because it's feudalistic, it's got these circles of power structures built into it, and whether it's sort of, I think when people start playing D&D, they start seeing parts of it in real life and start
Yeah.
analyzing relationships. So I think that's a
Yeah.
really good feature built into it. But I'll
Yeah.
move on to another question, which was
Sure.
from one of our great artists, and I think somebody who you interacted with on Twitter as well, Alika, who asks, since there are so many types of horror outlined throughout the entire book, what drew you to the specific dark fantasy gothic horror aspect for your setting?
Sure. So that was very intentional. And that was a response to me growing up in the 80s with Temple of Doom, Web Evolutions, all of this material that exotified India, made India look like it was this land of like monsters and evil things, and like brown people are, dangerous in all these terrible ways. And I was like, wow, I absolutely can't write any of those tropes. I have to be very careful of the way I approach this. Dark fantasy seemed a safer route because I could humanize the characters. I could make it more of a psychological horror. You could understand at least Ramia's choices. And, my original text, like I said, I wrote 30,000 words. So like there's a lot more about why Arajani is the way Arajani is. Certainly with Riva, she's very complex and a lot more going on there. And hopefully those hints are in the final text. But I had to make it a three-dimensional like setting and world, because some horror is quite good on this simply like these are broad strokes and these are archetypes and that's all you need to go with. But my fear with that, if I was doing this for Calicari, I'm the first Indian writer doing this for an Indian setting, is that's going to be misunderstood in the like Kali is goddess of evil kind of thing, and like we're going to make human sacrifices and eat, chill monkey brains kind of way of looking at it. And so I was like, there is no way I'm going in that direction. I have to approach this more of a psychological horror, more of a dark fantasy, and allow the land and the people to live and breathe. And that was my goal with that.
I think you've succeeded on that count because there are already like plans that I've heard from other game masters within the community of how they plan on, if not borrowing ideas that you've already, sort of shared, but just porting some of their smaller campaigns into it, because everybody who loves Ravenloft gets a great kick out of like remixing the tropes a bit and then borrowing from our own stories like of our
Sure.
culture. I'm looking forward to a lot of games coming out actually being played and stuff. But another question which was asked by Arvind is what were the ideas that didn't really make the cut or had to be cut, because going from 30,000 words, I'm sure hard choices, kill your babies and all that when it comes to a writer's life. But
Yeah.
what do you most regret that you
Yeah.
made it that way? Yeah.
But I don't have a lot of regrets at the end of the day about what had to be cut, because that's just part of the creative process, and you have to be able to handle that and be like, oh, I'm not like I think there's sometimes somebody who goes out there like I'm the auteur genius, and like if you touch my words, you're a monster. That is not my mindset. I believe in compromise. I believe in like reworking within the frameworks. I think I'm going to write an article. Chuck Wendig and I have been talking a little bit, and he would love me to write for his blog, Terrible Minds. So I might write something about the favor system as I envisioned it originally, so that all of you kind of understand like what those cultural implications were. And that was probably, if I were to say one thing that I would really wish I could have gotten in, was the really complex favor system.
If there's any last thing you want to say, I would like be okay to release you, since I know you're way beyond your schedule.
Sure, no.
So that's...
Yeah, you can definitely follow me on Twitter, and that I think that'd be useful. My wife, who's goes under the Strix, actually talks a lot more about game design stuff, so she has lots of threads about it, because that's her full-time job. I would recommend following her as well. But I just want to say it is an enormous pleasure, Samir, and the entire community to be speaking to you and having this opportunity. In many ways, this is probably the most important. I've spoken a lot about games in a lot of different conferences. This is probably the most important one for me, because you are my community, and I care about the community. I care about India very much, and so for all of you to be here and be interested in this is a dream come true. So I'm really appreciative of being invited. And please create. Please write. Make your own work. Put it out there. Put it out in DM's Guild. Work together. Reach out to me. If you put out something, I will do my best to promote it and put it out there. But just keep on creating and putting out more material, and then start, start pinging those publishers and start establishing relationship with publishers so that your own work gets into the ecosystem. I would love to see more Indian creators making more work for D&D and for TTRPGs.
I think that's the perfect last word to, and close our interview and discussion on PanicNot and just create, guys. That's all we can really do to get out there. Thank you once again, Ajit, for taking the time, and hopefully we'll have you back when you've got your secret project out and about,
Sure.
and you start promoting us, and we'll be all over it. So thank you, and guys, everybody for showing up. Really appreciate it, and remember to follow on Twitter and Instagram Strix as well as Ajit. We'll have a lot to learn, and you can hope to see a lot of work coming out of this from the community because I know that it's gonna be insane. You'll be blown away. Give it a month. Okay. All right.
That's exciting.
Thanks so much, Ajit.
Thank you. It was a
Bye.
pleasure. Bye.